So Suparna asked me to do a little bit of an overview from, I guess, my own point of view on this field of critical neuroscience or set of perspectives. So I'm very pleased to do that. I should say that for all of us, it's a bit of a challenge in the sense that it's hard to critique something that you don't know a lot about. And the danger is that if we only have a superficial understanding of neuroscience, that we will critique from a point of view of just I guess very impressionistically and perhaps not have a lot of substance behind what we're saying. So that's a challenge for those of us who don't have a background in neuroscience, and probably a recommendation to say that you do need to learn more neuroscience to be on a firm footing in some ways with at least some of the things that we talk about. On the other hand, there's a lot that can be said just at the level of the circulation of images and ideas, and that's some of what we'll talk about. This, incidentally, you can see it very clearly, is a painting I'm very fond of by the Lithuanian-American painter Samuel Bach. So this whole course and related activities really comes out of a new initiative we have at McGill, an interdisciplinary initiative between psychiatry, philosophy, anthropology, social studies, and medicine on culture, mind, and brain. And this is funded in part by the Foundation for Psychocultural Research, a private foundation in Los Angeles that is headed by Rob Lemelson, an anthropologist who's interested in seeing if he can support work that puts together ethnography, cultural anthropology, psychology, and neuroscience, whether we're maybe at the point where we can have some meaningful, productive kind of dialogue interaction. And they have a conference coming up in October on culture, mind, and brain, emerging concepts, methods, and applications, really talking about cultural neuroscience. But the critical neuroscience perspective is really taking a step back from that kind of engaged work of developing social and cultural neuroscience, a step back to ask what are the concepts we're working with, what are the underlying assumptions, and can, in the process of critique, can we not only raise concerns and dilemmas about how these ideas are circulating in society and the work they're doing for various interests, but can we actually contribute to a creative process? And I think that's very much the spirit of the work. So this is what I'm going to try to say very quickly. We're supposed to take a break at 1:30, so is that right, or is that the schedule? So I'll try not to go too much past that, but as usual, I put lots of slides because everybody knows my problem. So, okay. So this is what I'm going to try to touch on very quickly, what we might mean by critical neuroscience, some varieties of critical neuroscience. And for myself, coming to this as a psychiatrist and as someone who sees the power of the rhetoric of neuroscience in everyday practice, why this is an important area of critical thinking, and then something about what this might mean for the future. So as I understand it, critical neuroscience really takes the idea of critique in a very broad way, not only out of critical theory or critical anthropology, but really as a broad program of systematically questioning, challenging the taken for granted wherever it may occur in scientific activities and in the circulation of neuroscientific ideas. This necessarily, I think, and we can have discuss this, does not imply, cannot imply a kind of view from nowhere. What it really means is taking a framework from one discipline or perspective and applying it, something that comes from outside, applying it to think about what we're doing. So the kinds of critique that are available to us are as diverse as the backgrounds we bring, as the perspectives we bring to look at things. So critique is a kind of rubbing two things together to clarify them. And the aim, though, and there's a very clear direction or vector to this. I mean, the aim is to try to reveal what is hidden in some way, and hidden either simply because it's a blind spot that's built into the particular metaphors or conceptual models we're using, or because there really are interests involved in making sure that certain things stay hidden, whether it's economic interests or political interests or our own personal psychological motivations and so on, or some interplay of all of these. I think that critical neuroscience differs from neuroethics, which has become quite a big field in a sense. I mean, there was a bunch of support from the Canadian Institute of Health Research and other institutions around the world to set up chairs and programs in neuroethics. And in that area, it's really been about the impact on healthcare and healthcare decision-making of new technologies and so on. So it's a rather focused, pragmatic set of applied ethics issues. And I think critical neuroscience, in a way, encompasses and includes that, not to be too territorial or grandiose about it, but it really tries to look much more broadly at the circulation ideas. And in that sense, it's necessary even for an effective neuroethics, because anybody who's operating in the field of neuroethics looking in a healthcare setting, let's say, at how certain ideas are being applied, is going to need to be able to step back and look at what assumptions are going into that, what assumptions are built into the kind of knowledge that's available already within neuroscience, what assumptions are built into the models that we're using to think about these problems. And finally, I think a distinctive feature of critical neuroscience, owing in part to its origins from people who have a background, namely Suparna and Daniel and others who have a background in neuroscience, is that it is not meant to be a destructive critique. I mean, I guess it is meant to be destructive of things that are out and out harmful when people encounter them. But overall, the idea is there a way to critique that is constructive, that is creative, that leads to not no work in certain areas, but to better work, better conceptually and better in terms of thinking through its implications. So that's my take sort of on the broad background. This is the foundational text, I guess, of the field. The Bible, everybody must go buy a copy, which of course means like 2 months' salary for most people. But anyway, we gave you some chapters, so that's okay. Now, I think there are many different varieties of having sort of claimed this broad territory for the field. I think there are many varieties, as you already heard. Part of this is conventional science studies or history of science to locate neuroscience in its historical, social, and cultural contexts, to resituate its theories in terms of the actual styles of reasoning and institutional affiliations and practices of the people who generate such work. To understand the evolution of the field in terms of broader social, cultural, historical trends, to expose the origins and the meanings and limitations of specific metaphors that come to dominate our thinking of the brain or aspects of brain functioning, and to look at what kinds of ontological assumptions about the nature of the world and epistemological assumptions about how we can know things about people, about the brain. To give a concrete example, some time ago, Suparna, Ian, and myself wrote a small commentary in the new American Journal of Bioethics, Neuroscience, which speaks to the emergence of this as a discrete field. They had to have a separate journal from the American Journal of Bioethics to have a sub-journal now that's Journal of Bioethics, Neuroscience, and we wrote a commentary in response to a Target article that advocated using brain imaging to detect people who were potential terrorists. And the notion that somehow this would go eventually beyond what we could do with a lie detector, which is already highly suspect, and enable us not only to see people who had done something in the past who were hiding it, but see someone who might do something in the future. And at the same time that you're standing at the airport being scanned, in one way you could maybe be scanned in another and diverted to the right channel in the remote Caribbean camp. So clearly this is very concerning, the ways in which these technologies and the assumptions they make about what we can or can't know about people are impacting on our everyday lives. And again, in psychiatry, what's particularly important around this is the extent to which psychiatry has come to assume that everything we really need to know about people we can probably learn through their brains. And we could have a psychiatry that was really stripped down and based on high technology, and that would just be based on brain knowledge. And so part of the program is to sort of challenge that and to try to point out what's being left out in that discussion. The methods involved, I think it's important to acknowledge, again, that a core method is the neurosciences themselves, and particularly cognitive and social neuroscience, that being able to use those, to engage that literature directly and to use it to think through problems, to challenge them in their very formulation in the first place. So that's the sense in which this activity is part of the very field that it's also critiquing, which of course raises tensions and dilemmas, but which also gives a lot of grounding, I think, to what we're doing. Philosophy is very important in both, and this is interestingly an area where the two broad, traditions is the wrong word, but the two, what were they, the two civilizations, the clash of civilizations between continental phenomenological philosophy and analytical philosophy has really broken down significantly within the field of cognitive neuroscience, where you have people like Sean Gallagher and Evan Thompson and others who really work from both traditions, putting them together in very interesting and meaningful ways. So that's actually an example, I think, of something very constructive that's coming out of this whole area already. And then all the social studies of science that are pertinent in this area. And then this broad, returning to this question of moral and ethical critique, which is just to say that even though some of my colleagues who work in social studies of medicine are very careful often to try to bracket off or to deny the fundamental moral and ethical critique, I think we need to recognize both that that's often our most intense personal motivation is our sense of injustice or some wrong or some imbalance in society, and we need to sort of be taking things back explicitly to that. Okay, a few more ideas then about how this then relates to the actual work that we're doing. A central interest in all of this is in what we could call cultural constructions of the brain, and I mean that in three different senses. The most straightforward sense, I guess, in terms of constructivism, that our concepts of the brain are culturally constructed. So the way we think about the brain has a cultural history, and it's interesting to look at that and where that comes from and how that shapes our research and our application of brain science. But this is where it gets maybe very thick and complicated and loopy, which is that the brain itself is a cultural construction, that the fields of social and cultural neuroscience tell us that the reason the brain is plastic until our 20s is precisely to acquire culture. That the shaping of the brain itself reflects an evolutionary history that is actually a cultural co-evolutionary history. That is to say, we have for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, whatever, lived in human groups, and we have a brain that is very preoccupied with, designed to do a lot of calculating about human groups and our status in groups and our affiliation with people and so on and so forth. So the brain itself has on many different time scales traces of its cultural history and is reshaped by that cultural history. So this is the whole field of social and cultural neuroscience that gives a different meaning to the idea of cultural construction. And then finally, a culture itself, whatever we might mean by culture, is something that is being constructed through our emerging notions of the brain. And this is the idea really of culture as a moving target, and all the things we've heard today about new forms of subjectivity and new ways of thinking about ourselves. So these are different plays on the trope of construction, of cultural construction, and I think they're all of interest to us. And there may, or definitely are, in fact, complex interplays between these three kinds of activities. Briefly, the brain itself as a discursive and aesthetic object, that is how we construct our languages of the brain or about the brain. There's been a whole history of dominant metaphors going back to the idea that the brain was just I think this is a Galenic idea or something like that the brain was basically just a ventilator, that it had all these folds and stuff because it was kind of like, it had fins like an air conditioner, and it was just getting rid of all the heat produced elsewhere in the body. To the idea that the brain is really just a mediator between something at the level of spirit that is pulling the strings, to the telephone, and then all these, as our information technologies and communication technologies have gotten more and more complicated, each generation of those have lent a new metaphor to the brain, essentially. So the telephone, switchboard, analog or digital computer, cybernetic control system, parallel distributed network, and we saw the image of the connectome as Jan's image of the connectome as the sort of current version of these things. Throughout all this, it's not simply that the brain is this interesting technological appliance, but that the brain is our most intimate and personal and personable organ. That is to say, our brain is who we are. That where we are located is somewhere behind the bone of the skull, and so we are deeply invested in accounting for the brain in some way, because that is going to be at the same time an account essentially of human nature. At least that's how the story goes. And Around that debate then is the current, say, ongoing kind of struggle represented by the writings of somebody like Steven Pinker and so on, between an account of the brain as, at one extreme, a tabula rasa. It's just a universal learning machine and just depends what it's exposed to, and it will just acquire all these programs, and there's an enormous and bizarre range of possibilities for how we could function and think about ourselves, versus the idea that the brain is a finely tuned, evolutionarily adapted organ to deal with a certain kind of environment that perhaps no longer exists, but for which it, out of which it emerged, and that we can understand all kinds of problems in terms of the tensions between what the brain was originally designed to do and what we force it to do by virtue of our current world. So this whole discussion is extraordinarily important these days because evolutionary theory and accounts of the brain are used to explain all kinds of human problems and naturalize them in some ways. More recently, there's been a lot of emphasis on the plasticity of the brain, which means a variety of different things. Catherine Malibu's written about this at length, arguing that there is a parallel between our accounts of plasticity and our fascination with the plasticity of the brain and the idea of mobile capital in the contemporary world, and that in a sense it's a kind of market view of the brain fitting in, occupying its niche, if I can borrow that metaphor for a moment, to function in a global market. And finally, kind of what we could call the Zen brain, I guess, this notion that the brain as a self-observing, self-transforming vehicle could in fact be the ladder that we use to transcend ourselves in some way. And this is the conjunction between people studying the neuroscience of Buddhism on the one hand, I suppose, and a lot of artists, including Robert Irwin and others who share interests around that. So looking at the recent history of this is interesting for me because when I was an undergraduate in the early 70s, this was my great excitement, was encountering all this literature on cybernetics and so on, which came out of the Macy conferences and Gregory Bateson and a lot of other people who were involved with that. And this is a recent book by a sociology of science, Andrew Pickering, who previously worked on quantum physics and sociology of quantum physics, who's been looking here at the emergence of this cybernetic discourse, I guess the rise and fall, I could say, of this cybernetic discourse. This is the key period in the 40s. I mean, a lot of this work began, actually, some of this work began during the Second World War. People like Norbert Wiener and so on occupied with developing control systems to guide missiles and anti-aircraft things and so on using cybernetic control systems. But then soon after the war published, this material, I guess, got declassified and published, and so there was this rise of this discussion of cybernetics, of the way in which the brain was fundamentally a control system. And these are the key players in this, several of whom were psychiatrists as well as mathematicians or physiologists. Gray Walter with his little this is the insides of his little turtles that were like little robots that could move around. There's a zigzag showing that it's finding its path as it searches for light. And then Norbert Wiener, the mathematician and sort of founder of cybernetics, and W. Ross Ashby, psychiatrist and theoretician of brain control systems, and my own personal favorite, Warren McCulloch. I'll come back to him in a second. And here is from Google Ngram, which is a cheap way to do historical research for those of us who are too lazy to actually do any real research. Which just, if you don't know Google Ngram, this is a search engine now that exists that was developed by researchers at MIT to do what they call, I think, cultural omics now, they call it, or something. Basically, all the books that Google has now scanned and digitized, you can now do free text searches in. So you can look for when did a certain phrase occur, and you can do this in different languages. And so it gives you an interesting, by itself it's hard to interpret, but if you look at several different phrases, you begin to get some kind of interesting comparison going on. So here are three phrases. The blue line is a term cybernetics, the red line is neural networks, and the green line is cyborgs. I'll come back to that at the end. So it just shows you, first of all, sort of the heyday of cybernetics, kind of, and then when it began to taper off as an enthusiastic literature. And the heyday, it looks like it also levels off a bit here of neural networks. So my favorite, as I say, is Warren McCulloch, who is an extremely quirky and interesting character, who's a psychiatrist and I guess what we call him, a theoretical neurobiologist or something, we'll call him that. So he wrote with Walter Pitts, a young mathematician. I think he was in his teens actually when they wrote this paper, very famous paper, in which they basically took the idea of a neuron and thought of it as an abstract entity, and showed that giving it some very minimal properties, they could generate all of sort of propositional logic or sentential logic, basically, and then out of that heading toward the idea that you could then have an abstract model of the brain as a computer. One of my own teachers, D.O. Hebb, around the same time, and really quite independently from this, wrote an important book in which he argued that the way we could think about the brain was as cell assemblies, that there were circuits of cells that became associated because of reinforcement, because of contingencies that made certain cells fire at the same time. The idea of if cells were made to fire at the same time, they would become connected in some kind of circuit with each other. So this was a kind of developing the idea of associationism. And this became subsequently very important for people in neural network theory. They often trace the genealogy to sort of Hebb's idea and then try to instantiate this idea of Hebbian learning, where two things that fire at the same time will become associated somehow, and discovering the properties of these networks. And then extraordinarily important person in many different fields, the kind of conceptual inventor. The person who's conspicuously missing from all this, I should say, is Alan Turing, who really was the mathematician who made possible the idea of a universal computer in people's minds. But building on his work, John von Neumann, who could have designed the original digital computers, and who wrote this very interesting book in the late 50s, arguing that the brain was a computer, and that we could distinguish between the hardware of the brain and the programs that it was running, which I think became part of our contemporary language. So just to say, and one of the points that Pickering makes about the cybernetics movement is, just as we talk about neurosciences today as being linked to the arts and so on, this was an extremely creative group of people who were very interested in the arts, very interested in the liberatory possibilities of cybernetics. Stafford Beer, one of the people influenced by this, was involved in helping Salvador Allende, devise a system that would enable a true democracy, rule of in which workers could get information, representations of processes in the country, and actually make real-time decisions about the economy and stuff like this. So there was a lot of kind of visionary stuff that occurred in and out of the tub at Esalen by this group of people. I mean, the group I showed you earlier standing around with Warren McCullough and so on, I don't think they were in the hot tubs together. They don't strike me as exactly that kind of group. But there was a later and group influenced by these people who certainly were part of that whole counterculture is the wrong word, but a kind of a creative efflorescence of ideas. At the same time, there's something deeply, I don't know, conservative or let's just say disturbing about the implications of these technologies. And this, for me, is an emblematic image of the neurosurgeon Jose Delgado, who, building on the earlier work on midbrain, deep brain stimulation and reinforcement and so on, did these experiments where he would implant electrodes in animals, in this case in a bull, and was able to sort of bring the bull to his knees by flipping a switch. So he actually has a video of where he's doing the matador thing, but he has a thing with a radio controller you can see there, and he flips the switch and the bull is brought to its knees. There's something, talk about the aesthetics, there's something deeply ugly and disturbing about this image and the way it sort of violates the idea of the bullfight. And I don't know if this is going to play, let's just see. I mean, these are, again, the yuck factor in bioethics, where people talk about things that just, just feel deeply disturbing and wrong in some way. We want to articulate exactly what the problem is. He did experiments where he, building on the work of actually Jim Olds and Peter Milner at McGill, where they discovered pleasure centers in the brain. This, at Hebb's suggestion, they'd implanted electrodes in the midbrain and found that there were areas where rats would keep bar pressing to get self-stimulation. And then following on that, these were human experiments, people with intractable depression who had the idea being, well, if we can give them some pleasure, they won't be depressed anymore. And indeed, they found places where people would press these buttons. And this woman was describing how the feeling for her is like having an electrode going all the way down to her genitals, and it's kind of stimulating feeling. There's another video of him interviewing a young man. I think it's a video, it may just be an account, interviewing a young man who has this thing and who starts developing homosexual feelings toward Heath, although he had no history of homosexuality beforehand, but was having these powerful sensations in a new context. So this was very controversial work at the time. There were a lot of ethical issues raised, and Heath himself was in I guess, a defensive position, eventually had to sort of abandon this work at Tulane University. So the neurotechnology raises immediate and powerful, you can see, the neuroethical issues as well as conceptual issues. This shoots through all of our thinking about human beings. So this is another very important set of metaphors coming from the psychosomatist researcher Paul MacLean and his idea of the triune brain, that we have a phylogenetically layered brain. We have the oldest parts of the brain in the central brainstem core, and he called that the reptilian brain. It's involved with basic survival things, regulating autonomic function and so on. Then we have the paleomammalian brain or limbic system, which is involved with emotion and attachment, and the neomammalian brain, which is involved with reason. And this kind of thinking has influenced a lot of work in psychiatry, the idea that we have a sort of emotional layer to the brain or kind of specialized circuitry. And even though many people have abandoned the language exactly, the limbic system, and talk in a more differentiated way, there's still plenty of models that harken back to this. This is from a very recent review article by Amron Meyer from UCLA, talking about brain-gut regulation and the role of emotions in brain-gut regulation. You see that it's got limbic, sensory, and motor cortex as part of explaining all of this stuff. So this brings us to the situation of psychiatry, proposing that this article by Tom Insel, the head of NIMH in the US, and Remy Quirion, who at the time was the head of the Neurosciences and Mental Health and Addictions branch of CIHR, the Canadian counterpart, proposing that psychiatry is really going to be clinically applied neuroscience. And the two technologies that they hold forth that are going to make this possible are essentially genetics and brain imaging. That those are going to give us ways of understanding mental health problems in purely biological terms. We'll be able to understand the brain as being something that gets broken. We have these models being promoted by pharmaceutical companies. This is a thing from a psychiatrist's office in Israel showing the serotonergic model of depression and widespread appeal of genetic models and brain imaging models in psychiatry. And I probably won't say more about this now. Maybe we'll have a chance to come back to this. So let me just skip ahead to make a couple of last points. Yeah, I'm not going to belabor this because we don't have time here. So I just want to argue that in addition to finding these kinds of gripping scenarios and case examples that need just call out for some kind of careful analysis of what are the assumptions and what are the implications, we need to do this in a way that helps us to bracket the received wisdom. And here we are up against what Ian Hacking has called the looping effect of humankind's, the fact that the categories and the models that we're using for the most part to think about things are coming from these same fields. It's quite hard for us to step back from the images of ourselves that come from contemporary neuroscience. They really do permeate society. And so we need this we need the expertise of neuroscientists to show us that it doesn't have to be this way. There actually are competing theories for the same thing. We need the expertise of the historian to show us it wasn't always this way. There was another interesting version of this, and the one that won out for complex reasons. And we need the ethnographer to show us what forms of life these different notions of this is my animated loop here, of these models are at play. So if we think of what kinds of loops are we looking at, we have internal loops, what in hacking is called biolooping, ways in which the ways we understand ourselves become part of our own bodily experience. And we have this sort of socio-political economic looping. And here in the case of psychiatry, I've just represented some of the sites where the links are made in a kind of, to form a kind of closed circle that's self-perpetuating. So I have the pharmaceutical industry, the American Psychiatric Association, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, this great institutional fact that reifies our diagnostic categories and becomes part of the everyday practices of clinicians everywhere, universities that train people and that generate knowledge, the practitioner themselves who is in the interaction with a patient, negotiating the meaning of an event and promoting it through prescribing and through other activities, and the clinic setting itself. All right, I got to show all my little animated loops. That's very exciting. And my arrows. Okay, so the other point is the idea of biolooping from the Ian Hacking introduces suggests that we not only have these loops that can be traced purely at the level of discourses of models that are being passed around and they're being implemented as institutional practices, but these impinge in on people's actual experience, the way that they interpret what's going on in their body, the way that therefore the way that they react emotionally and so on. And that becomes part of the reinforcement and part of the way in which these things become a fixed reality. And I'm going to, okay, so I'm going to end with these few images and reading recommendations. So to the extent that we understand ourselves as brains, there are all kinds of interesting implications. So on the left is a classic science fiction novel by Anne McCaffrey, who some of you may know more for her Dragon Riders novels years ago. These were very popular. But this is a disturbing set of stories that she wrote years ago of a world in the future in which very severely deformed children, babies who are born very severely deformed, their parents are given the option of having the child encapsulated in a little metal sphere, and they can become a brain that can be installed in various kinds of machinery, in this case to control a spaceship. And so this whole story is the relationships between this spaceship who has a human brain, and her human companion, who's the brawn. They're the brain and the brawn is able to go around and do things when things need a wrench or something to be fixed. And it's a romantic story, among other things, but deeply disturbing story, and lends itself to this, I guess, profound sense of strangeness of what it would be not to be embodied in the way that we're familiar, but to be in fact embodied in a sense, but in a radically different way. The flip side of that is the notion that, well, if the brain, if mind is really not the brain, if mind is really the programming of the brain, which some would argue, then maybe it could be instantiated on different substrate. And so this is a brilliant novel by Richard Powers on the creation of sentient artificial intelligence, in which an English a writer and a comparative literature professor is hired to train a neural network to become conscious. And it's about his relationship with this neural network and his relationship with other women and the difficulties therein, and I highly recommend it. And then this other novel by Richard Powers that brings us back to the question of embodiment and to the notion that it may be that we can't instantiate, we could instantiate consciousness on a neural network, but it would not be human consciousness, because what makes us human is our bodies. And so this is a novel by Richard Powers about a man with neurological syndrome, Capgras syndrome, which he has a truck accident and his brain is damaged. He becomes convinced that people around him have been replaced by imposters, in particular that his sister, who comes to care for him, has been replaced by an imposter. And what's powerful about this book, it begins with this image of these birds, these migratory birds. And the illusion is really to say there are parts of who we are, parts of our sociality and so on, that are hardwired into us in a way. And if those get damaged, we are fundamentally different in how we relate to others. And you experience that not only from his point of view, but from the point of view of his sister, who then has the opposite experience, which is, even if it's true that part of us is hardwired into us, part of us is socially constructed and socially reinforced. So having a loved one who's close to you, who tells you that you're not you, is deeply destabilizing, as happens for his sister. So this sense of the social construction itself is also present there. The two are played off against each other, is typical for Powers novels. And another important character in this is a neurologist who's written many books on people's subjective experience of neurological problems, who comes to visit to help out. So he's modeled on Oliver Sacks, and there's a whole ethical issue about him exploiting his patients for the sake of his literary fame in this book. So, and finally, last book to recommend before our overdue break. This is a book that actually you can download online for free as a PDF, or you can buy if you like. And it's by a science fiction writer who's actually a biologist. And it's about first encounter with alien life, and it's his attempt to imagine a profoundly different form of consciousness, or a profoundly different form of sentient life, let me put it that way, because more hinges on that. I won't give anything away, but what I do want to say is that the crew on the spaceship that's sent to try to figure out what this alien life is filled with people who are all neurologically different. Because of the idea that maybe you're going to need all of these strange people. So there is somebody on the ship who has antisocial personality and who does not react empathically to other people, so that will be helpful, or does not react compassionately to other people. There's somebody on the ship who has multiple personality disorder, who can be very different people at different times. There's somebody on the ship who has Asperger's syndrome, and there's somebody on the ship finally who has a very strange syndrome who's actually been reconstructed from lost DNA. It was a lost line of hominids that has these intense feral and agonistic impulses, very, very aggressive and intensely and also carnivorous beings who also have seizures whenever they encounter crossed lines. And so there's a whole biology, and the book is full of footnotes at the end to legitimate neurobiology literature showing that all these things are extrapolations based on what we know. So all of this, unless you think that I've gotten totally far out now, is to end with this image of the idea of neurodiversity and the claims right now that actually there are different kinds of brains, and they're not only broken brains, or brains that are less than others, but brains that are fundamentally different than others, and that there might be virtues to those brains, and that we have to think of a form of social life in which we would acknowledge those virtues. So this is to speak to what I had last on my list of topics, our post-human futures, the possibility that we might have different ways of being, and the more we understand the brain, we more understand its creative possibilities. That's the end of my blurb here. So.